This is a Look Forward interview from S&P Global. My name is Nathan Hunt. I'm joined today by Dr. Lindsay Newman, head of geopolitical thought leadership at S&P Global Market Intelligence. We're going to be discussing an article Lindsay wrote for our recent Look Forward report entitled A Pragmatic World Reorder. Lindsay, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Nathan.
Lindsay, since the end of the Cold War, we've learned to think of the world as a set of markets, of opportunities. What has changed since the start of the new decade?
What we've seen since the start of the new decade, and certainly accelerating over the last several years, is that a world grounded, a world ordered by globalization, by geoeconomics, has quite rapidly become a world ordered or grounded in geopolitics. We're seeing, for example, since Russia invaded Ukraine just last year, that a host of geopolitical risks like global security, like supply chains, energy transition, have been thrown in the air, are right now being in the process of reordering as we sit here today.
How do you think this will change how countries interact?
Well, we're hearing a lot almost every day about how the world is becoming fragmented, that perhaps we've entered a multipolar world. Maybe it's a bipolar world. Some even have suggested it's a zero-polar world. Really, nobody is leading us forward. But there seems to be something, Nathan, about human nature that it wants to understand where we currently sit, classify where we currently sit. But we think that we're actually in a period out of equilibrium, that we're going to see the world rebalancing over the next decade, and we haven't really landed anywhere yet. But it's not all bad news, because instead what will define the years ahead is a set of shared challenges like the energy transition, like climate, like pandemics, that will require shared solutions. Nobody's going to be able to solve this for all of us, and nobody can solve it on their own. And so instead, we're going to see what I'm calling the new pragmatism, where countries are collaborating in certain spheres and competing or contesting elsewhere and simultaneously in pursuit of their own national interests.
It seems to me that countries have always been rather ruthlessly pragmatic, rather than, say, idealistic in their actions. How big a change are we talking about?
It strikes as a pretty significant change if you think about pragmatism versus ideology. If we think about the Cold War, the post-Cold War period of democracy promotion, what we saw, for example, with U.S. engagement in what was in wars overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan, what we're seeing now is really not ideologically driven. It is about pragmatism. It is about solving those shared challenges and also about advancing one country's own national security interests.
We're talking a lot about countries. How do you see this new pragmatism affecting corporations?
I love that question because I'm thinking a lot about this right now. What we've learned over the last couple of years is there can be quite local tests that can have ripple effects globally. So we, for example, have a pandemic that starts in one part of the world and we have ripple effects throughout the rest of the world. What we're seeing then is that countries are now reacting to these tests with certain policies. We see, for example, in the U.S., the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act. These are part of increasing trend we're seeing towards industrial policy, defending and protecting one's own supply chains. That's meaning that corporations, business, can no longer sit on the geopolitical sidelines because countries' incentives are being passed along to be companies' incentives. And they're now needing to navigate that environment, to have advanced warning systems, to understand the indicators, to understand their timelines. And that's something I'm dealing with every day with my clients.
Let's take an example you cite in your article, India. Does India currently demonstrate this new pragmatism, or do you see them evolving in that direction?
So India, as you say, is increasingly going to be a critical player in the international order and the international system. We think that in the next decade, it's going to become the third largest contributor to global GDP growth, just behind mainland China and the U.S. So watching India is critical for us all to be doing. And what we're seeing with India is, on the one hand, we have India as a part of the quadrilateral security dialogue with the U.S. and Australia and Japan. They are tackling together these shared challenges like humanitarianism, like pandemic, security, cyber, tech. India recently joined IPEF last year in 2022. But on the other hand, we have an India that's also still a very big trader with strategic competitors of those partners that it has in the Quad, including mainland China. And we also all saw a key trend last year was India purchasing Russian crude oil, taking up that Russian crude oil. So there is currently new pragmatism that India is undertaking, and it's something to keep watching.
One of our colleagues, Dan Jurgen, has written extensively about a world order defined by the need for fossil fuels. How do you see geopolitics changing with the energy transition on the horizon?
Absolutely. So geopolitics in the 20th century, as Dan has so eloquently laid out for all of us, was defined by fossil fuels, the scramble for fossil fuels, the scramble for oil. We saw relationships and partnerships form off the back of that. And we think that as we look ahead to the 21st century, geopolitics will be defined by a scramble for critical minerals. Those minerals that will be fueling the energy transition as part of electric vehicles and the battery supply chain. And what this means is that we're seeing countries, as I already mentioned, pursuing industrial policies and accompanied by a host of supply chain strategies like reshoring, bringing their supply chains home, nearshoring, bringing their supply chains to their neighborhood, or ally shoring, making sure that they can secure their supply chains with close friends and allies so that they can ensure that they have those access to those minerals that will be needed for the energy transition ahead.
Let's talk about Australia for a moment. There was a bit of a diplomatic conflict between the U.S. and France on the sale of military equipment to Australia. Unusually, the U.S. seemed to do little to assuage French concerns, despite the fact that France is a key ally. Australia is a key source of raw materials necessary for the energy transition. Is this an example of the new pragmatism at work?
Absolutely. What we're seeing, for example, is a couple key trends that you point out there. First of all, Australia will be a key ally, a key close partnership with the U.S. and the West for those critical minerals. But they're not going to be the only source of those critical minerals because these are in-demand minerals that will be required to go to other partnerships throughout the world. The second is, interestingly, the U.S. and French relationship. So we saw just last year that they together sprang forward once Russia invaded Ukraine in partnership to support Ukraine, to support really Europe. But then we had Macron's visit late last fall, the state visit to the U.S., where he brought a message not just of partnership, but also a concern about U.S. protectionism, U.S. interventionism in the electric vehicle space and really in the broader energy space because of the Inflation Reduction Act. So we're seeing there that countries working across one sphere together, the security sphere together side by side, really shoulder to shoulder, to support Ukraine, and a commitment that seems to be sort of endless. But on the other side of it, that they are looking at each other sort of in competition. And we now have this announcement of a perhaps European Green Deal industrial policy to counter the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act. So that is, in fact, how these countries are navigating the way forward through this pragmatism, competing in certain spheres and collaborating elsewhere across mutual interest.
Thank you for joining me, Lindsay. To read Lindsay's article or the other articles in our Look Forward report, please see the show notes. Thank you.